Hello everyone and welcome back aboard the Night Train for another 80th anniversary video celebrating the Railway series. I've been asked in the past what my favourite Railway series books and or stories are, and after making my video on the top 10 Railway series stories that I would have liked to see adapted in the TV show that weren't, I thought I'd take my what if thinking slightly further. If I was given free rein to add an entire volume to the official Railway series canon, what would I do? There was lots to contemplate, such as what new locations I could explore, what new characters I might introduce, and what would work organically with the world set out by the Audrey family. I also don't want it to be too influenced by the TV show, yet I also want it to be easy enough to adapt into that version of Sodor, either in model form or CGI. As I pondered all of these questions, I decided to start with one basic one. What real-life railway environment have I been to that is not represented in the Railway series, but would have been a fantastic addition? And one very obvious kind of railway sprang to mind. Zoos. There are far more railways in zoos and wildlife parks in the UK and abroad than I originally imagined. The first one I encountered was the monorail at Chester Zoo. Then there was the line at Drayton Manor, which is a Thomas land. There's also a line at the Cotswolds Wildlife Park, another one at Marwell Zoo, but my favourite has to be the actual heritage railway built by Alan Pegler of Flying Scotsman fame within the grounds of Whipsnade Zoo. Other zoos that feature railways include Blackpool Zoo, Longleat Wildlife Park, Woburn Safari Park, and there are probably loads of others I can't think of at the moment or haven't discovered yet. All these lines are built to various different gauges, and it also varies whether they are powered by steam or diesel. It's mostly the latter. Carriage design is almost always unique to each location, helping to give each zoo railway its own identity. So, how would a wildlife park railway work in a Railway series volume? I think quite easily. Adding a wildlife park to Sodor is straightforward enough, and even happened in the 14th series of Thomas and Friends, though the interior was never properly explored. Outside of the TV show's hard canon, a wildlife park and internal railway was added in the comics by none other than Andrew Brenner himself, one of the magazine writers who eventually went on to become the head writer of the entire show. He's the person that gave us some of the best Thomas episodes, stories and specials since the original classic series run in the 80s and 90s. Anyway, back to the wildlife park. In the magazine story Narrow Gauge, Percy discovers a railway is being built in the wildlife park, but he's disappointed it's going to be narrow gauge, which stops him from running there himself. But in the subsequent story, Percy's disappointment is placated as the line is switched to standard gauge, and he takes the inaugural train around the zoo. However, the canon of the wildlife park in the comics gets a little murky, as in a different story, called Safari Park Special, a dedicated safari steam engine is delivered to run in the wildlife park, but it is minimum gauge and never given any kind of actual characterisation or real life prototype. There are other magazine stories revolving around the wildlife park, such as Some Most Unusual Passengers, which bears a resemblance to Thomas's tall friend, but with Percy in the role. Then there's also The Escape, which leaves a lot of the park's safety protocols questionable. The TV show had an established wildlife park, had a head writer who dabbled in zoo-themed railway stories, yet the show never capitalised on either of these beyond transporting animals to and from the location, which is perfectly fine for trainers to do, but with a railway inside the park you could do so much more. While we got Thomas's tall friend and Charlie and the Elephant, both decentish episodes, it was only in the Big World Big Adventures era of Thomas that we saw the internals of the park in Thomas's Animal Arc and Nia and the Unfriendly Elephant, but that was still only very briefly, and the less we say of the Big World Big Adventures era, the better.
It was time for Thomas to leave. He had seen everything. Everything.
While all this is a good broad starting point, I'm going to go back to the drawing board in terms of crafting this concept into a workable Railway series volume. Adding the wildlife park to an existing branch line with its own stop, like in the show, works. But is there somewhere better suited than Edward's branch line? I would probably put the wildlife park in the railway series in a corner of Sodor that canonically exists on Audrey's map, but was never seen in the existing volumes. I think it would fit well on the Norrumby branch, perhaps with a station halt just outside of Ballyhoo. The park can then be positioned reasonably inland with road access, rail access, and wide open spaces heading upwards and perhaps spreading partially into Henry's Forest. Not a railway series canon location, I know, but that's just what I know that area as. The park would then be near a town and a mainline junction, so would then be easily accessible to mainland visitors coming on trains running under Sodor's 1925 agreement with the LMS and the subsequent joint NWR/BR hourly suburban service that runs between Barrow-in-Furness and Norrumby. I think this makes much more sense than just plonking it halfway down Edward's branch line, which itself runs along a peninsula that is a bit out of the way. With the location of the wildlife park in-universe sorted, what about the railway inside it that will be the focus of my railway series volume? I want to use the Great Whipsnade Railway and their preserved engines as a template. The Whipsnade line is 2 foot 6 inches in gauge, but for simplicity's sake and to allow for more storytelling potential, I'm going to reduce this to 2 foot 3 inches in gauge for Sodor's wildlife park. This is the same gauge as the Skarloey Railway, allowing engines to visit and experience different locations and jobs. Seeing Sir Handel have to deal with a stubborn camel on the line has a very funny appeal to it, for instance, and matching the gauges allows the imagination to run wild with different scenarios. The railway, as I see it, needs several things to work. One is a meeting point with standard gauge lines, such as an adjacent station or yard for the Wildlife Park Railway's characters to interact with the existing standard gauge characters. The railway should pass through enclosures to offer close encounters with animals that may change the course of the stories, so the line will run through different safari habitats as well as close to fences keeping more dangerous creatures at arm's length. The railway also needs a passing loop or a stopping point, such as a station by a central restaurant or a gift shop, so that visitors can alight or board the trains. And finally, there needs to be an engine shed and maintenance area, carriage storage, and a departmental train featuring wagons, cranes, flatbeds, box wagons, and brake vans. All of this offers everything the railway needs to function, as well as ample purpose with lots of animals to see, and reasons for guests to travel on it. I've mapped all of this out in AnyRail as a bit of fun, representing a mock-up of how this might look in practice. It's certainly unique among the railways of Sodor, predominantly being a self-contained loop line. So that's the railway itself planned out and the permanent way laid in a hypothetical manner. But what about the engines and characters themselves? I can't just throw on some random narrow gauge engines and coaches. Audrey was far more adept and thoughtful of his characters and engines than that. I want to retain some of the Whipsnade's influence, that's for certain. Their Kerr Stewart Brazil class engine Excelsior, which I did a footplate experience on just a few months ago, looks too similar to Peter Sam in shape and colour, so unfortunately I cut it from consideration. Superior, the Mattery class 062 tank engine, is Whipsnade's flagship steam locomotive and offers a unique look and wheel configuration that's not seen in the Railway series core set of characters. This is perfect for a main character and a flagship engine for the book. Now I have to craft a character from this engine, and I have the real thing in my collection in model form. The red is deeper and richer than the Skarloey liveries, doesn't really pop in the same way as a lot of other Railway series liveries do. One colour not really represented by existing characters, and which looks fetching on Rapido's newly announced Sodor class locomotive, is a warm burnt orange. Some lighter cyan lining on the tanks will help break this up and soften it a touch as well, making it unlike the rest of the narrow gauge engines, but still in keeping with Sodor's style of livery. But what's a good looking engine without a name? I was pondering more natural names than Superior for such a locomotive, but wanted something that was influenced and almost synonymous. A name that could blossom with personality that called to me was Hercules, a name that can be strong, fiery and wild. So here we have the makings of our first character, Hercules. That's one engine down, but I think a fleet of 3 should suffice for a 4-story volume. While the railway series lent heavily on lines such as the Talaclin and the Snowdon Mountain Railway, and to a lesser extent the Festiniog, there are many other narrow gauge railways, both historical and preserved, with engines that didn't get much attention or inclusion. For the concept of my envisioned volume though, there's a lot that I can just rule out immediately. Narrow gauge tender engines and Garretts are just too big and unsuitable for a wildlife park tourist line. A lot of the really small industrial engines like the Hunslet Quarry engines and the Bagnall 040s wouldn't be suitable for pulling packed, multiple coach trains all day every day. So I narrowed down my search to bigger, more powerful tank engines. The ones that sprang to mind as prominent and perfect for the Railway series appreciation for realism are the Vale of Rydal Railway's 262 tank engines. They have a wholly unique design with their long side tanks that extend beyond the smoke box. And while the Vale of Rydal inspired locations in the Railway series and the TV show, no engines from that line were ever included. Taking one of these Swindon-built narrow gauge engines as a basis, our second character would need regauging from 1 foot 11 3/4 inches to 2 foot 3 inches. In terms of livery, I don't see these engines looking right in anything other than Great Western Green, but I decided that instead of having big yellow lettering, we'll have some orange lining and red nameplates. For a name, being obviously a Welsh engine by heritage, I decided to stick with a Welsh name as well. Gethin called out to me for this loco, with it being linked to Lord in Welsh, which is another strong, capable name with ancestry. That just leaves a third engine for the line, but this time I'm going to look to the southwest at the old Linton and Barnstaple line. Sticking with the large tank engine requirement, an engine that looks well suited for a zoo railway is the Linton and Barnstaple's Manning Wardle 262 tank engine. Fitted with a cowcatcher, this would look right at home with the other large tank engines and yet sufficiently different at the same time. Much like the Vale of Rydal tank engines, Sodor's resident Manning Wardle 262 tank would need regauging from 1 foot 11 3/4 inches to 2 foot 3 inches. For the livery, I think we can use a blue here as the main colour instead of green, surrounding it with white lining while keeping the black areas as they are. Naming this engine is difficult as the original Linton engines were named after river systems. The nearby rivers on Sodor, such as the Hoo, Arle and Els, don't really lend themselves to character names. I had to think outside the box a bit and decided to look to famous naturalists, given the engine will run in a zoological environment. Of the names I considered, Darwin felt the most natural. It's themed, but not too on the nose for young readers. So here's our trio of engines: Hercules, Gethin and Darwin. But they need zoo-themed carriages to pull on their safaris. The ones found at real zoos that I think would work best for the Railway series style are Longleat's coaches. They are semi-open, with open doorways and comfortable seats bordered by windows. They have a British Railways inspired blood and custard livery, so on Sodor they can run in this livery as well. It is a bit of a lift and drop, I admit, but it works and looks good with all of the engine liveries I've just outlined. We have our engines, and while I've defined their prototypes and looks, I've not really gone into the characters or personalities I envision them to have, though you may have spotted some clues in their real life counterparts. Hercules is an engine who I see as confident but perhaps occasionally too headstrong. Gethin, by contrast, has a short fuse and a pushy temper. This and his long side tanks gives him a metaphorical and physical tunnel vision, so to speak, where he can get lost in his own grievances. He likes working alone, but is also not completely self-aware, so can be clumsy. He's sort of a halfway house between Duncan and Sir Handel, though those two characters naturally have some mood overlaps anyway. I think given the environment Darwin's having to work in, a fairly repetitive loop with animals that may cross his path when he doesn't want them to, this is an understandable mood for Gethin to be in most of the time. Darwin, though, by contrast, is the most laid back and caring of the bunch, keen to take things slow and steady as to not upset the animals. His cowcatcher is a visual indicator of his respect for the animals he runs openly next to, and when he's in the mood, he can scold the other engines for any reckless behaviour. Darwin's chief flaw is he can be too cautious and have mishaps that way, and while he's kind to the animals, depending on their mood, they may not necessarily be as considerate back. The other engines see him as sometimes a bit of a wet blanket, but more often than not, Darwin ends up having quite the insightful point. The line will also need to be managed, and as it's within a zoo, this will require a new controller. We already have the fat, thin, and small controller in the Railway series, but no tall controller, which rounds off the size-named quartet. So, who shall the tall controller be? While the engines can call him that, I think their official role in the zoo should be attraction manager, as someone needs to oversee all of the attractions within the zoo itself. I see the tall controller as a lofty 6'8" man who has to duck beneath most shed doorways, and as someone who makes the engines look smaller than they actually are. He dons a tweed suit with a red tie and a black and white striped waistcoat, a slight nod to his employment field. He's got a bushy moustache and thin hair on a balding head. Stick a safari hat on him and he'd look like a rich oligarch on an exotic hunt. In terms of discipline though, he handles the railway with a firm but fair hand that melts away whenever he interacts with any of the animals, showing the sincere softy underneath that contrasts with the seriousness with which he handles railway management. That rounds off the personalities we have to play with in the stories. Speaking of which, what stories can we tell with this new line and setting? It's no secret Audrey liked pulling from real life events to write his stories, so I'm going to attempt to do the same. The first thing we need to do is introduce the wildlife park to Sodor through a familiar set of eyes. Then we can give the engines their own tales and escapades within the park grounds. I'm going to take a similar approach to how the Arlesdale Railway and Rheneas were introduced, via discovery by an existing character and a tale told by the new engine. That forms the basis for story number 1 out of 4, which I've titled No Laughing Matter. Bear is tasked to take a narrow gauge engine to the wildlife park, where he discovers a railway that runs with the animals. En route, the engine, Hercules, details the railway's beginnings and how he was too big for the line when he first arrived, and ended up falling through a weak ha-ha. This is based on the real-life ha-has found at the Whipsnade Railway, and the real-life history of the former Whipsnade engine Chevalier, which was always deemed too big for the constructed line. The second story then shifts the focus to Darwin, and I've titled this one Darwin's Drop-Off. Darwin is tasked with delivering a buffalo to one of the paddocks, but he accidentally releases it into the wrong one, causing all trains to be held while the keepers try to catch it. This one, I admit, isn't based on any specific real-life event, but it sounded like a fun premise, so I decided to stick it in here. You know, creator's liberty. For the third story, I'm going to capitalise on Gethin's basis and personality, so I've titled this one Gethin's Tunnel Vision. When Darwin delays trains after not wanting to disturb a stubborn camel on the line, Gethin decides to show him how it's done, but he winds up cementing an uncertain future for the railway. Safari parks with railways or driving routes are well renowned for having issues with camels that just get in the way and refuse to move off of the trail. So, of course something like this would happen on Sodor. This is what originally riles Gethin up, and while it doesn't actually prove to be an issue for him later in the story, his own mood and actions lead to some quite catastrophic consequences. All of this builds up to the final story in my volume, which I've titled For the Safety Record. Gethin is repaired and the engines all confide in each other about the threat of losing their railway. They decide to operate a flawless service with care and precision. When they discover a damaged fence though, a race against time to protect their guests and animals ensues. I'll say no more for now, but this gives a small arc for most of the characters and the line overall, while featuring plenty of animals, a good dose of zoological environment working, and real railway operation elements. It makes for a truly unique volume in the Railway series, akin to Mountain Engines or Duke the Lost Engine. Everything has been well laid out for future stories as well, such as the gauging matching the Skarloey Railway and having a main line and road link for bringing in characters all across Sodor. All the book needs now is a name and a cover, so I've gone with Wild Engines. Short, sweet, and it describes what's inside perfectly. And I have written full stories for each of these ideas and recorded them into an audiobook format to bring them to life as a celebration of the Railway series. I'll be releasing the audiobook shortly after this video goes live, complete with sound effects to make for a unique, immersive experience. So that's my personal preference for if I could add my own volume to the Railway series canon. Now it's the big question for you lot on the other side of my screen. If you could write your own volume of the Railway series, what or who would it be about and why? Would you expand the world building and lore like I did? Or would you focus on pre-existing characters and locations and flesh those out a little bit more? Let me know down in the comments. If you like these more long-form, hypothetical or essay-based videos from me, do let me know that as well, and also what you'd be interested in seeing me discuss in the future. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll be back in another video very soon. Take care.